We all know the words, "This is Sparta," from the famous movie 300. The Spartans were known for their harsh upbringing of future warriors, but also for their sharp-tongued wife who had more rights than any other women in other Greek city-states or even in the ancient world. Although we think that we know a lot about the Spartans, there aren't many written sources to be found. How is it possible that such an awe-inspiring ancient capital with great achievements didn't feel the need to write their accomplishments down? Perhaps they thought that action spoke louder than words. Or did they have secrets that they wanted to Spartan kick into the Tartarus? Hi everyone and welcome back to a new video. My first video of 2025. I actually wanted to make one each month, but as always my work was very busy, so this was the only time that I had time to make a new video. I also find it very hard to choose subjects that I want to cover because I really don't know what you guys would like to see. I always have to guess. So if you know a subject that is suitable for this account, then you can put your suggestion in the comment section and perhaps I will cover your suggestion. I have done it once before. Someone asked me to talk about werewolves and I did just that. So it's not that I won't do anything with it. For this subject, we will go back to ancient Greece, when Greece was busy fighting all kinds of wars, like the Greco-Persian War, the Peloponnesian War, the Battle at Pylos, and many more. During this time, Sparta was known for their military education, their social structure, and their unique way of life. And of course, they were known for the mythological story of the abduction of Hellen of Sparta, who would become Hellen of Troy. And the question we will tackle today is, do the Spartans still exist? And if they don't exist anymore, how did their reign end? Well, let's find out, and as the Greeks say, pame mazimu, come with me. As most people know, Sparta was a prominent city-state located in the region of Laconia in the southeastern Peloponnese during ancient Greek times. The ancient Greeks used three words to describe the city of Sparta. The first one being Sparta, of course, which came from the main cluster of settlements located in the valley of the Eurotas River. Sparta was located on the banks of this river, and the river was the biggest river in Laconia. This river also provided fresh water to the city. The Eurotas Valley was a natural fortress which made it a perfect location for a settlement, so therefore Sparta came to be. Not only did they have an advantage with this forest, but they were also separated from the region Arcadia by hilly uplands that reached 1,000 meters. These natural advantages protected Sparta from sacking and invasion. Sparta also had its own vessel harbor called Gythio, and this harbor was located on the Laconian Gulf. The second word that they used to describe Sparta was Lacedeamon, which was mostly used in the work of historians and writers Homer, Herodotus, and Thucydides. One mythological story tells the story of King Lacedeamon, who was the mythological king of Laconia. He was not only a king, but he was also the son of the supreme god Zeus and his lover, the nymph Thyete. And this name will come back later in the story. But he wasn't a king at first. He only became a king when he married the daughter of the king of Laconia, who was named Eurotas, like the river. And his daughter's name was, you might guess it, Sparta. When Lacedaemon became king, he decided to name the country after himself and the city after his wife Sparta. Together they got 3 children, their son Amyklas, and their daughters Eurydice and Asine, from which the eldest 2 would also become a part of Greek mythology. The last name they used to refer to Sparta was Laconis, which referred to the area surrounding the town of Sparta. Homer described the countryside of Sparta as white, lovely and shining, but also as often hollow and broken due to the ravines in the area. He also described it as the country of lovely women. The residents of Sparta weren't even called Spartans, but rather Lacedaemonians. Although I think Spartans has a nicer ring to it. Perhaps that's why we prefer to use that term in modern times. But what was life like in Sparta? Their focus on military fitness started young, even at birth. When a baby was born, their mother would bathe it in wine to see if it was strong enough. If the baby survived this deadly bath, it would be brought by his father to the Gerousia, which was the council of elders. They would decide if the child would be raised or not. If the child looked puny and deformed, they would throw the child from the Mount Taygetos, which was the highest mountain in that part of Greece. Perhaps if you have played Assassin's Creed Odyssey, this sounds familiar for you. And of course, if a baby was thrown from this mountain, it would not survive the fall. Although these stories are there, we have never found evidence of baby corpses at the ground near the Taygetos mountain, but they did find bones of adult men, which were most likely slaves. After infancy, the children would truly learn the Spartan way. I will discuss the boys and girls separate because the girls were not allowed to follow the same training program as the boys, which was known as the Spartan Training. The Spartan Training started when a male Spartan turned 7 years old. They would enter the Spartan Training program known as the Agoge, which comes from the word ago, which means to lead. Only then could you become a full citizen of Sparta, which was known as a Spartiate. But not every boy was allowed to participate in this training. Your mother or father had to be a member of the Spartiate class themselves. But only 10% of the population had this status. Without this status, you were known as a tropimoi. Of course, the women were excluded from this program. If you were a slave, which they called a harrod, or if you were a motax, which was known as a free non-citizen, they were mostly children of slaves that were R-worded, you were also excluded to follow this training. If you were a tropimoi with some sort of special recommendation or special connection to the king or influential people from Athens, you had a chance to participate in this training. If you were the firstborn son of the kings of Sparta, you were always excluded from this training because you were the heir to the throne and you couldn't be harmed. So, as a 7-year-old Spartiate class boy, you would enter this training at 7 years old and you would complete your training at the Agoge when you were around 21 years old. But this was not the end of the whole experience, and even in these ancient times, this training was known to be very brutal, very violent, and in some cases even fatal. The Agoge was divided into 3 age groups: the Pedis, the Padiskoi, and the Hebotes, corresponding to young boys 7 until 12, adolescents 12 to 20, and the last group being young men between the age 20 until 30. During this training, the men were deprived from sleep, food, and shelter. They were only fed the right amount of food to make sure that they stayed fit, so that they would never feel sluggish or become too full. It was also a way to teach the boys how it feels to not have enough. This way they could also learn how to survive without a lot of food in times of privation, and they would also learn how to steal, because stealing was allowed, but you had to make sure that you weren't caught. If you were caught, they would beat you. But this was also a lesson. This way the boys could learn to be more stealthier and more resourceful. Beside the military training, the boys also studied reading, writing, music and dancing. But the early stages of the education focused mostly on the development of skills you needed to have in the military. These skills were taught during athletic events such as running and wrestling. These competitions were intensely competitive, and in many cases the boys were even encouraged to use violence against each other. They were required to live in barracks or in some cases even outside without shelter. They were also restricted to have any contact with the outside world. So many boys didn't see their family for decades. But this was not even all the hardship they had to deal with. They had to participate in bare feet so that their feet would harden and they would improve their agility. They were only allowed to have one item of clothing, which was a cloak, per year. Plutarch claimed that the boys had to build their own beds with reeds that they pulled out of the Eurotas River with their own hands. There were harsh punishments when you failed to answer a question being asked, or if you didn't answer the question the Laconian way, which meant you had to be briefly and witty. They believed that wittiness would help the Spartans poke fun at his peers and that they would not be bothered when they were teased by others. As a Spartan boy, you were expected to take an older man as a male mentor, which was most of the time an unmarried young man. This mentor was supposed to be a father figure to his pupil. Of course, there were other stories going around that some mentors took advantage of their position. And I think you can imagine where I'm going, so I won't go further into this. But a man called Xenophon, who was a great admirer of the Spartan educational system and enrolled his own sons in the Agoge, denies that such horrendous things happened there. I guess we will never truly know. The second phase of the training was considered to be the traditional phase between a child and an adult. The boys were encouraged to integrate themselves into the adult society. Their athletic competitions and physical training were intensified and became even harsher. At 20 years old, the boys would become true Spartan men and they would graduate from the padiskoi, which translates to those who have reached physical adulthood. Although they were true Spartan men and they could be eligible for military service and they could cast a vote, they were not yet considered full adult citizens. You could earn various jobs if you could impress the elders during your training. For example, there was a job and you could see it as a secret police and it was called the Cryptea. Or you could be chosen to be a part of a highly esteemed infantry cohort named the Hippies. When you reached your 30th birthday, you could graduate from the Agoge and then you would truly be accepted into the Cistian and you were even allowed to start your own family. You would also receive some land, which would be farmed by the helots, so the slaves. If you were not accepted into the Cistian, you could not become a full Spartan citizen. You would still be an elite citizen, but with less status. There is much more information to be found about the Agoge, but what was its main purpose? Well, mostly, according to Plutarch, it was to prepare the boys for the harshness of war and everything your body had to endure during those times. It was also a way to learn the Spartan boys to live for the whole population instead of only themselves. They were training for the biggest part of their lives because most people didn't turn 60 or even older, so half of their life was spent in training without their family and friends. They were constantly in competition and they learned what it meant to be a Spartan citizen. When these boys would turn into true Spartan citizens, they would be hard as stone. Their minds and bodies would withstand anything, and that was the true Spartan way. But what about the women? We don't have a lot of information about the education of Spartan women. It is believed that they also had an extensive formal education cycle, but with less emphasis on the military training. Their education was known as musicae. This education included music, dancing, singing and poetry. They were taught choral dancing so that they could take part in ritual activities. And this made Sparta unique, because there was no other Greek city-states that provided formal education to their women. You could say that the Spartans were ahead of their time. This is also the reason why Spartan women were different from other Greek women or even ancient women. And this started at birth. Unlike in Athens, the Spartan girls were fed the same food as their brothers. They were also allowed to leave the house for some fresh air, and they were also allowed to compete in sport and exercise. When it came to marriage, the Spartan girls were spared to be married off very young at the age of 12 or 13. It was even forbidden by Spartan law. The Spartan girls had to wait until they were in their late teens or early 20s to be married off. The reason was to ensure that Spartan women were able to deliver healthy babies. But the biggest reason was because if a girl got pregnant very young, they were often ill for the rest of their life or unable to produce any more children. The Spartan women were also allowed to wear dresses that were called peplos, and they were less concealing than the dresses that they wore in Athens. As I mentioned before, the Spartan women were allowed to leave the house for some fresh air, and therefore they were allowed to wear clothes that helped them to move more freely. They walked around the city in their slit-up-the-side dresses, or they drove in their chariots. In some cases, they were even allowed to be nude in public, especially during the festival of nude youths. Spartan women were also literate and numerate, which was also a rarity in ancient Greek or even in the ancient world. Due to their education and their free movement in society, they were even allowed to speak their minds, which is a rarity in these days even. In fact, they were even notorious for it. Plato praised the Spartan women for their ability to discuss philosophical topics. Spartan women even had economic power because they were allowed to control their own properties or the properties of their husbands. Mostly because their husbands were often away with the Spartan military, and therefore the male population also declined. 35% of the land in Sparta was owned by women. Spartan women were also allowed to receive the inheritance of their father if their father didn't have any male children. She was also not forced to divorce her husband to marry one of her relatives to get some of her inheritance. And because the Spartan women were treated so well, they often reached a higher age than most other Greek women in ancient times. Most of the women didn't even reach their 35th birthday. Another interesting fact that I found out was that some Spartan men shared their wife with another Spartan man, and not for pleasure, but for breeding. Parents of Spartan children had to be the most physically fit parents in the whole world. And of course, older men were not fit, so sometimes they allowed younger, fit men to impregnate their wives. In some cases, a childless man could request another man's wife to bear his children, especially if she already proved that she could bear healthy and strong children. Since the Spartan population was hard to maintain due to the constant absence and loss of men in battle, this practice was encouraged. This way, they could have a Spartan population with the most strong-bodied children. Newborns were even highly inspected. Any sign of weakness could mean abandonment or an offering to the gods. How did Sparta become so powerful? Well, most of the things I mentioned earlier helped them to become a powerful state. The thought process that only the strongest could survive would help them to become this powerful state. Weakness was forbidden or punished. Their social structure was built within their training, and eating together to build a bond was also necessary to complete your training. All Spartans were seen as family, and you always had to protect your family. In other Greek city-states, you would only fight when a war was coming to your city-state, but in Sparta, you always had to sit on the edge of your seat. This gave them an advantage, and this also made them almost unbeatable. Spartans lived to serve the army. Another reason why they became so powerful was because of their political system. Although other Greek city-states also had a political system, the Spartan one was quite unique. Sparta was ruled by 2 kings. Although it sounds like they had the absolute power, that was not the case. They were only important in times of war, so that they could lead the army as the commanders-in-chiefs. They would take 1/10 until 1/3 of the spoils for themselves. With that wealth, they bought a lot of land, making them one of the richest men in Greece. If the war was over, they would function as judges and priests in the Garusha, which was the Council of Elders. Or you could also call it the Spartan Senate. The council had 28 members. You had to be over 60 years old to be a member of the council, and women were of course not allowed. When you were elected for life. And since you were already 60, I don't think it was a very long time. Their judgment weighed the heaviest. They could even sentence the kings. The council could sentence the Spartans to death, but the kings were only allowed to do that when they were in the army. The kings were honored as gods. They even claimed to have contact with the gods. And they did all the honorary services. Over time, many Greek city-states got rid of their kings, but not Sparta. The two kings were both from two different Spartan lines of kings called the Agids and the Eurypondids. The kings were always followed by someone from their own bloodline, and both of these royal lines claimed to be descendants of Heracles. You could not step back from your duty as king. If you inherited it for life. And as a king of Sparta, you weren't allowed to marry anyone who wasn't born out of a Spartan mother. Next to the kings and the Garusha, you had the ephors. They were elected by the popular assembly. All the citizens were eligible for election, but you could not be re-elected. The ephors provided a balance for the two kings, who rarely worked together. They presided over meetings of the Garusha, and they were in charge of civil trials, taxation, the calendar, foreign policy and military training for young men. Two ephors always accompanied the army, and they were even allowed to arrest the kings if they felt the need. They had to do that. They would also keep an eye on the helots in case that they would misbehave or betray the Spartans. One other important assembly of Spartan politics was the ecclesia. Every Spartan male full citizen who turned 30 was entitled to attend the meetings at the time of each full moon within the boundaries of Sparta. At first, their meetings were held within the agora, but they were later transferred to a neighboring building known as the Skias. The Spartans were also aligned with the Peloponnesian alliance, which gave them a dominant position within Greece and helped them to fight against rivals like Athens. Since the Spartans were trained at a very young age, they knew a lot of victories in the battlefield. When they won the Peloponnesian War against Athens, they reached the height of their power. This gave them hegemony over Greece. The Peloponnesian War took place between 431 and 404 BCE, and as I mentioned before, it was fought between Athens and Sparta, the two leading city-states at that time. It was one of the most momentous wars up until that time. The Athenian alliance was an empire that included most of the island of coastal states around the northern and eastern shores of the Aegean Sea. Sparta was the leader of an alliance between independent states that included most of the major land powers of the Peloponnese and central Greece, as well as the sea power in Corinth. Therefore, Athens was the strongest on the water with their navy, while Sparta had the stronger army. But Athens was way wealthier than Sparta. They owned a large war chest that they had received from the empire. Before the war started, Athens and Sparta had a treaty called the 30-year Treaty. It was a truce that they agreed upon around 444 BCE. Eventually, Athens allied itself with Codicia, which is modern-day Corfu, which was a strategically important colony of Corinth. They started to fight, and Athens even took steps that violated their 30-year treaty. Sparta and their allies accused Athens of aggression, and they threatened with war. But the Athenians refused to back down. Even diplomatic efforts failed. War was inevitable, and in the spring of 4031, a Spartan ally called Thebes attacked an Athenian ally Plataea. This was what broke the camel's back, and the war truly began. The war lasted for a very long time, and it could be divided into two periods. The first period took around 10 years and was followed by a truce of 6 years. After the 6 years of truce, Athens was in political turmoil. Their democracy was overthrown and replaced by the oligarchical party. They also had an outbreak of plague that ravaged the densely packed city of Athens. Athens was ultimately defeated due to military overreach, strategic miscalculations, and effective Spartan tactics. Especially the financial help of Persia helped the Spartans to build a massive fleet under the leadership of Lysander. He won a streak of decisive victories in the Aegean Sea, and Athens had no choice but to capitulate a year after and lost all its empire. But the Spartans also knew defeat. The most famous battle was the battle at Thermopylae, where the famous 300 Spartans showed the world how to persist and become true heroes. It was fought in 480 BC between the Achaemenid Persian Empire ruled by Xerxes I and an alliance of Greek city-states led by Sparta under King Leonidas I. The war only lasted 3 days, but it was one of the most prominent battles of the Second Persian invasion of Greece and the wider Greco-Persian wars. King Leonidas had an estimate of around 7,000 men under his command, while Xerxes had anywhere from 70,000 to 300,000 men under his command. You would think that this would be an easy fight for Xerxes, but the Greeks were able to maintain their position for a while. They used the sea and hillside to their advantage and made a line of a few dozen yards to stop the Persians. The Greeks held their defense for 2 days and only suffered light losses. The Persians, on the other hand, had suffered many casualties. The only reason why the Greeks would lose this fight was because they were betrayed. A man named Ephialtes was desperate for a reward, so he decided to inform Xerxes of a path that went around Thermopylae. If the Persians would follow the path, they could avoid the Greek army and ambush them. Xerxes decided to let Ephialtes take a portion of their army and lead the way. They destroyed a portion of the Greek army. Leonidas was forced to call war council, and he decided that retreating would be the best option. But as a Spartan, you were not allowed to retreat. That was against the law. Therefore, Leonidas decided to stay behind together with his 300 bodyguards, some Helots and 1100 Boeotians. They fought bravely, but they didn't stand a chance against Xerxes' army. They were defeated in a very small amount of time, and many, if not all, including King Leonidas, were killed. This gave the Persians access to southern Greece, and they were also able to expand their Persian empire further. Even though the Spartans lost this battle, they were celebrated for their heroism and persistence against impossible odds. The Greeks decided to build a stone lion in honor of those who had fallen, but mostly for their beloved king Leonidas I. Of course, this was not a victory for Sparta, but after all their victories, it seemed like Sparta would always have a big role to play in the history of Greece. But eventually, and unfortunately, they would fall prey to their own downfall. Did they fall out of favor with the gods? Or did their pride eventually cause their demise? In 464 BC, a violent earthquake occurred near Sparta and destroyed much of what was once Sparta and other city-states in ancient Greece. It is even said that this earthquake was one of the key events that led to the First Peloponnesian War. They were able to rebuild it, but many of their iconic buildings were lost. After all these events, they would still exist and fight, but they weren't as strong as they once were. They couldn't depend on their own Spartan strength anymore, so they were forced to build a wall around the city. And they did it after 184 BC. In 396 AD, Sparta was sacked by the Visigoths, who would we now call the Germans. And in the Middle Ages, the political and cultural center of Laconia shifted, which made Sparta less important in local affairs. The decline would go on until modern times. If we want to know about the history of Athens, we could go to a library, pick any book, and we could find the information we needed to know. There are a lot of resources where we can find how they lived and what happened in the history of their capital. After all, Athens was known for its philosophers and writers. But the Spartans, on the other hand, their actions spoke louder than words. But there are some ancient writers, mostly from Athens, who wrote some things down about Sparta, like Herodotus and Xenon, but there are not many that talk about Sparta in their work. Perhaps the Spartans had secrets that they wanted to take into their grave. And they succeeded, since we do not have a lot of information about them. We only know a little about their lives, training, successes, and about what Sparta once was and never will be again. Sparta as a city was never as glorious as Athens or Corinth. Only the Spartan citizens were famous for their actions and morals. There are no architectural structures that you could visit nowadays, like the Acropolis in Athens or some great amphitheater. In fact, is there anything in Sparta worth visiting? If you would go there now, you would only find the remains of their ancient theater, the sanctuary of Athena Haliciotou, and the sanctuary of Artemis or Thea. The Acropolis and Agora in Sparta don't even have the structures from ancient Greece anymore, rather from the Roman times. Not many text is found about the state of Sparta, but the Athenian historian and general Thucydides had this to say about it. Suppose the city of Sparta to be deserted and nothing left but the temples and the ground plan, distant ages would be very unwilling to believe that the power of the Lacedaemonians was at all equal to their fame. Their city is not built continuously and has no splendid temples or other edifices. It rather resembles a group of villagers like the ancient towns of Hellas and would therefore make a poor show. But this is about ancient Sparta. We also have modern Sparta. This was created in 1834 by King Otto I of Greece. He was only 19 years old when he ordered it, but this Sparta is not located on the same spot as the old Sparta. So the last question remains, are there any Spartans left? Well, they dug their own grave eventually. Persia was successful in interfering in Greek politics, which eventually led to a weaker political position for Sparta. And after that, they also lost their first land battle with a full-strength Spartan army at the Battle of Leuctra. Another factor that also didn't help was that Spartan citizenship was only inherited by blood. After many generations, the number of Spartan citizens declined, but the Helots, who were the slaves, would increase in numbers and would eventually outnumber the Spartans. The Helots were always revolting, and most of the time the Spartans could keep them on their place. But eventually the Helots were successful, and their revolt would give the Spartans some taste of their own medicine, and the Spartans would never recover. And since Sparta has been relocated in the 19th century, officially there are no Spartans left. But of course you always have people walking around this earth who perhaps have ancestors that come from Sparta. It could be you, it could be me, who can tell? I wouldn't mind to have an ancestor from Sparta. I think it would be very cool if I knew for sure that I had one. And I would always tell everybody to be a show-off. In conclusion, Sparta had a great power and it still has that reputation till this day. I can say for certain that everybody has heard about them. Whether it's due to playing a video game, watching a story about Sparta on the silver screen, or perhaps you even know a club that is called Sparta. For example, in the neighboring city we have a football club which is very famous in my country called Sparta, and my dad always goes there. So even though they kind of forgot to write about themselves, their stories live on in modern times. The unmatched warrior city-state who treated their women better than in other Greek city-states and trained their men to become the strongest fighters. They served their city with flesh and bones instead of walls and bricks, and this led them to many victories, but also defeats. But even though if they knew defeat, they always kept their head held high, and therefore they will always be a big part of Greek history. Thank you for watching my video about Sparta. I really hope you liked it. I loved doing the research even though it was hard, because as I mentioned many times in this video, it was really hard to find written sources. Anyway, let me know if you know another subject for my channel that you want me to cover. If you like it, please give me a thumbs up, that would help my channel to grow. Share it with your friends or give a comment underneath this video, that would also help me a lot. And I really hope to see you the next time. Bye!